Alright team, so in this video we are going to be investigating the connection between the amount of energy available in an ecosystem and how that impacts populations that can exist in that ecosystem. So let's go, let's get it. Okay, so again, when we're talking about an ecosystem, we're talking about all of the organisms that live in that ecosystem, everything from this bacteria and fungi in the soil to the plants and animals and insects, all those living things, as well as all the non-living components, the amount of water available, the temperature, all those abiotic components, right? Nutrients in the soil, wind, all of that stuff, right? And how all of those things come together to interact to create the ecosystem, right? So we see two general themes of how matter and energy move through an ecosystem. So when we're talking about nutrients, matter, schnapps, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, and all of those other trace elements that are necessary, those are typically cycled within an ecosystem. They can move between ecosystems, but usually those stay within the ecosystem. They're transferred from organism to organism through eating, decomposition, and so on, right? So those are recycled and reused, okay? The other main big process that we see functioning in ecosystems is this idea that energy is moving through the ecosystem. So it's passing through. It doesn't stay in the ecosystem like nutrients usually do. So for example, it's going to enter as sunlight. For most ecosystems, energy enters the ecosystem as sunlight. It's captured by photosynthesis and then moves through the different levels of the ecosystem as organisms are eating each other, basically, right? And so we graphically describe or display these relationships of how energy moves through an ecosystem using these food chains right here, right? So we have our plants that are capturing that sunlight, then that something comes along and eats the plants, these insects right here, these other insects eat these insects right here, right? So the energy is going to be transferred from organism to organism as they're eating each other in that food chain. And then the nutrients, that matter, is also transferred as well. It's just going to change form as it's moving through the ecosystem. But in order to understand how these processes work, especially how energy moves, gotta dive a little bit into some thermodynamics. I know, you're like, what? It was biology class. What are we talking about thermodynamics? That's physics. But organisms are guided and restrained by the laws of physics, just like everything else, right? So when we talk about especially how energy moves through an ecosystem, the laws of thermodynamics, especially the first and second law, really govern how that energy is moving through that ecosystem. So the first law of thermodynamics is basically saying, this is simplified, but basically it's saying that we cannot create or destroy energy. The amount of energy in the universe is constant, but it can change form. What does that mean for energy to change form, right? Well, if you ate anything today, you're taking the chemical energy, the potential chemical energy in the bonds of that food, and your cells are transforming it to another form of potential chemical energy in the form of ATP, right? So it's transforming that. Or organisms that photosynthesize, they transform solar energy, which is a form of energy, into chemical energy, right? So we can change the form of energy, change what type of energy it is, but we cannot create or destroy it. Okay, so that's our first law that's important for understanding how ecosystems function. The second law of thermodynamics says that every time energy changes form, so every time we convert energy from one form to another, some amount of energy will be lost or converted into heat in that process of transformation. And we talked about this when we talked about cellular respiration. So when our cells are going through cellular respiration, one of the byproducts of that process is heat, thermal energy, right? So when we're transforming energy from one form to another, some percentage of that energy is going to be transformed into thermal energy. And we say that thermal energy is quote unquote lost when we talk about ecosystems because thermal energy is not really a form of energy that is useful to living organisms to maintain their processes. And what I mean by that is that we can't use thermal energy to maintain the concentration of solutes in our blood. We can't use thermal energy to create action potentials in our nerves, right? So thermal energy is not necessarily useful to living organisms. It's necessary for some organisms to maintain homeostasis, but it's not useful in the sense that it doesn't help us with transforming energy into one form or another. So this is what we mean by energy flows through an ecosystem. It's going to enter as sunlight, feeding the plants. Then, as it's moving through each of the other levels of that ecosystem, it's going to be lost a little bit. We're going to lose we're going to lose a lot of that energy in the form of heat, okay, because heat is not a useful form of energy. So what we're looking at here, this is a graphical representation of the amount of energy that's contained within different levels of an ecosystem. So starting at the bottom with our primary producers are things like plants. Basically anything that can photosynthesize is considered a primary producer, meaning that it is the first stop of energy. It's the first organisms that produce energy for the ecosystem or within that ecosystem. So primary producers, usually photosynthesizers, right? Look how big that block is for the primary producers compared to the other ones, right? What we're showing here is that as energy moves from these primary producers to these organisms that we call primary consumers. So primary consumers are organisms that eat primary producers. Primary consumers are usually things like herbivores. They're eating plants. Look how much smaller this block is. There's not as much energy contained in that primary consumers block. Okay, so these blocks are representing the energy content of these different levels of the ecosystem. In fact, there's roughly only about 10% of the energy contained in the primary consumers relative to the primary producers. This is our 10% rule in ecology. Only 10% of the energy is transferred from what we call trophic level or feeding level, from one feeding level to the next. So we only transfer 10% of the energy from these primary producers to the primary consumers. 90% of it is lost. But where's it going? We'll get there in a second. So 10% of the energy is transferred from primary producers to primary consumers. 10% of that 10% from these primary consumers is transferred to the secondary consumers. Again, we're losing 90% of the energy as we go up every trophic level. Okay, so secondary consumers eat primary consumers. Tertiary consumers usually eat secondary consumers, sometimes primary consumers too. So we lose 10%. The amount of energy decreases by 90% every time we move through a trophic level. So in order to kind of understand, okay, why are we losing 90% of energy as we're moving from level to level, we got to think about what's going on in an individual organism and what is it using its energy for, right? So if you think about our energy budget, 100% of the pie that this buffalo is going to eat, 100% of the energy that it eats. Usually these guys are eating, plants, things like that. As this organism is eating 100% of its food, that energy is going to be used for different things. It's going to use roughly, this varies depending on the organism, but roughly 25 to 40% of the energy is used to just maintain its tissues for growth, for homeostasis, to, heal from any injuries, for reproduction, just to maintain itself. About 25% of the energy is going to go there. It's going to lose around another 25% of the energy, and I say lose, as it's using the energy for respiration, right? It needs to move. It needs to keep going through cellular respiration, keep making ATP so that way it can maintain homeostasis. Okay. We know that cellular respiration is not very efficient, so it's going to lose roughly, these are always estimates and it varies depending on species to species, but roughly around 40% of the energy that this organism takes in, it's going to be lost as heat, lost It's going to exit into the environment as heat, as thermal energy, right? And then it can't use all of the food that it eats for energy. So some energy is going to be not usable by this organism. It's going to be basically excreted as waste, right? Those molecules that it can't break down that have energy in them, but this organism can't break down, can't use them for an energy source, that's going to be excreted as waste. Okay, so again, these are estimates, but roughly about 25% of the energy for an organism in general is used to maintain its tissues, growth and development, things like that. About 25% of it is going to be used for respiration. About another 40% of it, roughly, is going to be lost as heat, which escapes to the environment. And then 10% of it is going to be excreted as waste. Okay, so that's basically where the energy is going. And so that's why around 90% of it is lost through cellular respiration, through heat, and through waste. Okay. So now if we take a larger, bigger picture view of what's going on in this ecosystem with energy. Energy is going to move from primary producers to the consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary, right? And so if we're losing 90% of the energy at every level, by the time we get high up there, tertiary, quaternary consumers, there's not a lot of energy left, right? So one of the main big ideas that can limit a population is the amount of primary production that's going on. How much photosynthesis, how much energy is being captured and stored in the tissues of plants through the process of photosynthesis. Okay? But what drives this process of photosynthesis? What determines how much photosynthesis can occur in a given area? Well, there's a few factors, but we're just going to focus on the really big ones here. So the rates of primary production is what we're looking at right here on this graph. Okay, so this graph right here, or this map rather. On land, the darker green the area is, the higher the rate of primary production. We can measure primary production in a few ways. It's typically measured by the chlorophyll concentration that we can estimate using some satellite images. And so on land, darker green, more primary production basically just means there's more plants there. In the oceans, the darker purple areas, that's where we have higher rates of primary production. Okay, so we can see a few kind of trends going on around the world. We can see that typically areas right around the equator have high rates of primary production. We see a little bit of a gap around 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. So in these areas, 30 degrees south, 30 degrees north, these latitudes, those are typically going to be desert areas. And then in the northern hemisphere range, we start to see the rate of primary production picks back up. So what's going on? Well, why do we have such high rates of primary production around the equator? It's really a question of what's that weather like at the equator, right? So the equator gets sunlight directly on. Sunlight hits the equator pretty much directly on. So it gets a lot of sunlight, really high concentration of sunlight. So there's a lot of solar energy available. There's also a lot of water due to wind patterns that govern how water moves around our planet. So there's plenty of water available around the equator usually. So the temperature's high, relatively stable throughout the year, pretty high average temperature throughout the year, and there's plenty of water. And those are the two big things that plants need to photosynthesize. They need plenty of sunlight, they need a pretty good temperature, which is determined by the amount of sunlight, and they need plenty of water. So right around the equator, there's a lot of photosynthesis because we have high rates of rainfall, and there's plenty of sunlight, which keeps it a relatively stable temperature that's amenable to photosynthesis. In these areas up here, 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south, those tend to be deserts where there's plenty of sunlight but not a lot of water due to, again, wind patterns. So low rates of photosynthesis here, mainly because there's not much water available. Okay, no water, no photosynthesis. or very little photosynthesis rather. And then again, we get up a little bit further up above that 30 degrees north range, and we're back to having plenty of water available. It's going to be colder, right? But there's still plenty of water available, and there's still enough sunlight that plants have adapted to live in these environments where even though it's colder, they can still exist there. Okay, so the big factors, the two big factors that determine the amount of photosynthesis is the amount of sunlight an area gets and the water available. Okay, sunlight also determines the amount of sunlight an area gets, also determines the average temperature of that area as well. Okay, those two things are pretty tightly connected. So now let's take these ideas of primary production and energy, and let's think about how they have implications for population size in an ecosystem. Population, remember, that's all of the individuals of the same species living and interbreeding in a given area. Obviously, the amount of energy available is going to determine how many individuals can be in that population. Populations, we typically talk about populations being limited by environmental factors. And we kind of break these up into two different categories: density-independent factors and density-dependent factors. So what I mean by that is that things like the availability of food, energy, the availability of water, habitat space, mate availability, diseases and parasites, these are all things that will put a cap or a limit on how many organisms of a given species can exist in that area. And things like food, water, habitat, mate, diseases, parasites, those are what we call density-dependent limiting factors, meaning that their impact increases as the population size increases. So if we think about population growing and expanding, there's only so much food available. The competition for that food is going to get harsher and harsher and harsher. It's going to get more competitive to access that food as the population increases. Those are the density-dependent factors, so they have an increased effect as the population increases in size. Versus density-independent factors are things mostly like natural disasters that will remove a certain percentage of individuals from a population, regardless of how large that population is. Things like a wildfire or a flood or earthquake, something like that, right? They're not dependent upon how dense that population is. They're just going to, random stochastic events that remove a certain percentage of the population. So all of these things, especially the density-dependent factors, things like food availability, habitat space, mate availability, things like that, we can take those and we can conceptualize those limitations on a population as what we call a carrying capacity. So a carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals an environment can sustain indefinitely. Meaning that based on the amount of food and space that's available, and water that's available, nutrients, whatever those organisms need to survive, what's the maximum number that can survive without overusing their resources, without drawing too much food out of the ecosystem, without using too much of their prey, without using too much nutrients, right? What's the maximum number that we can sustain of that population moving into the future, right? So carrying capacity is going to be different for every species because every species has different requirements for food, space, nutrients, things like that. And the carrying capacity can change over the seasons, right? Typically in areas that experience drastic differences in their seasons, the carrying capacity is usually limited, and the carrying capacity for the population is usually set by the more drastic season where we see less food available. In the northern hemisphere, that's typically, northern and southern hemisphere, that's typically going to be the winter season. Winter is when it's usually colder, there's not a lot of plant life that's growing, so there's not a lot of food available. in a population that experiences multiple seasons, typically the carrying capacity is set by the winter season. And so when we talk about population ecology, it's very common to graph out how populations change throughout time. And we kind of see two general patterns of population growth. We see what's called a logistic growth pattern and an exponential growth pattern. So let's take a look at what those are and what those look like. All right, so here we go. Let's tie this all together. So the amount of energy available determines the population size in a lot of ways, especially the amount of primary production that's occurring determines how much food's available, regardless of what trophic level you're at. So let's talk about one model of population growth that we call logistic growth curve, or an S-shaped curve is another name for it. So in species that exhibit a logistic growth curve like this one that we're looking at right here, what we're looking at on the y-axis, population size, number of individuals in population. On the x-axis is over time. So let's assume, just for the sake of this example, that we're starting with one male and one female. That male and female will mate. They'll have offspring. Those offspring will have offspring, right? So at the very beginning, we see a relatively slow growth rate. And that's because there just aren't a lot of individuals around to reproduce. Okay. Then, after enough time, population starts to increase in its growth rate. That rate of that curve, that slope of that curve increases, right? It becomes much more positive. This area right here of fast growth, this is where there's still plenty of resources around, and the population is at such a size that there's no issue finding mates. There's enough individuals there that are reproducing. So in this fast growth area, the natality rate, the number of new individuals that are added via birth, is much greater than the mortality rate. Okay, so high reproduction rate right here. As we kind of tip back over on this side of the curve right here, we see that the growth rate kind of starts to dip back down. So our growth rate, that slope of that line, kind of flattens back out closer to zero. But what's going on here in this slow growth rate? So here in this area of the growth over time, we start to see intraspecific competition kick in. What's that? Well, that's when individuals of the same species are competing with each other for any resource that they need to survive. Most commonly, this is going to be food. They're going to compete with each other for food, and this environment can only sustain so many individuals. The carrying capacity, which we usually use the letter K to denote carrying capacity, that's the variable that we use for carrying capacity. So they start to compete for access to resources, intraspecifically, usually food, habitat space, things like that. And that increase in competition starts to slow down the growth rate. But why does the growth rate slow down? Well, if there's less food around, not as many individuals are, one, going to survive. Two, not as many individuals with less food around are going to be able to reproduce. You need energy to reproduce. And if you don't get that food for that energy, you're not going to have energy to put towards reproduction, right? So the growth rate starts to slow back down, partly due to increase in mortality rate and decrease in natality rate, those two things together. And the population hits a stable equilibrium, right around the carrying capacity usually. There might, depending on the species, there might be a little bit of overshoot, and then it kind of dips back down, and then it'll kind of settle itself down right at that carrying capacity. Okay. So this is what we call an S-shaped curve or logistic growth curve. And tying this into another concept is usually organisms that present with a logistic growth curve tend to be what we call K-selected organisms. You're like, wait, did we just use that letter K to talk about carrying capacity? Yeah, that's not a random thing. K-selected organisms, what we're talking about with K-selection is organisms that have a natural history of 1, pretty long lives, 2, reproduce relatively infrequently, And when they do reproduce, they don't create many young. They have a relatively low birth rate. And there is usually some sort of parental care. So some sort of energy investment in the care and raising of those offspring that they have. Okay, this is a spectrum too. So K-selected organisms would be things like us, things like elephants. A lot of mammals are K-selected, but not all. So we have long lives, very few offspring when we reproduce. Spend a lot of energy invested in those offspring once we have them. And K-selected organisms also tend to take a relatively long time to make it to reproductive age as well. So that's our logistic growth curve. The kind of other type of model that we use to talk about growth curves or population change over time, population dynamics, is exponential growth. In exponential growth, these organisms tend to not hit their carrying capacity and stable off. In exponential growth, these organisms have a really rapid growth very early on. They reproduce very quickly. Then they reproduce so quickly that their population levels skyrocket above their carrying capacity, the maximum number of sustainable individuals that environment can support. So they're overusing resources. Food is depleted. Habitat space is depleted. Whatever resources they need to survive, that overshoot starts to greatly deplete the number of resources that are available. That overshoot causes a massive die-off of those individuals in that population. And then, because they reproduce so quickly, they kind of shoot back up, and then they die off again. And then they shoot back up, and then they die off again. So with exponential growth curve populations, that carrying capacity kind of shifts down over time due to these overshoots and that overuse, that overexploitation of resources. Because the resources become degraded, they become overused, overexploited, there's less of them available, and so the carrying capacity actually starts to dip off a little bit. Exponential growth curve organisms, we tend to call them R-selected. R is the variable that we use for growth rate. So these would be things that reproduce very quickly, have relatively short lifetimes, don't necessarily spend a lot of time or energy invested in their offspring, and when they do reproduce, they can have a lot of offspring. What does that sound like? Sounds like things like insects, right? Bacteria would also be R-selected organisms. So things that produce often, make a lot of offspring, don't necessarily live very long, and they don't have a lengthy developmental period to get to that reproductive age would be what we call R-selected organisms that show an exponential growth curve. So now this kind of begs the question, is carrying capacity constant over time? And like we saw in that video just a little bit ago that I was showing, that the amount of primary production changes over time, right? So that would definitely change the amount of food that's available to organisms. And what if the environment changes? What about what we're going through right now with climate change? That's definitely impacting the carrying capacity of different environments. We're changing how much the distribution of water around our planet. That impacts how much primary production can happen, which impacts the population levels of organisms at higher trophic levels, right? So carrying capacity is not constant, and it's an estimate, right? And this is something that population ecologists will often do, is they try to estimate carrying capacity, and then they'll ask questions as to, okay, what if this environmental change comes in? How does that affect the carrying capacity? What if we have a wildfire, right? And we remove 80% of the forest? How does that affect the carrying capacity? Okay, so those are really interesting questions, and that also have a lot of implications for human populations as well, which we'll deal with in another video. So there's our overview of energy and connecting that to population ecology. So let me know if you have any questions, and I hope that was helpful.